Hello, and welcome to Lighting for Storytelling. In this video course, I'm going to explain the fundamentals of how you can use light to help you tell a story in an image or a film or an animation. So how does lighting help with storytelling? Well, in storytelling terms, there's three main things that light can do. The first is to help with composition. And the way that this helps with a story is it directs the eye, it shows the viewer what's important in the image or the scene, and therefore it makes the story clearer and the scene more legible. The second thing that lighting does is to establish a mood. And thirdly, it also establishes a style. And I'll be exploring all three of these key roles of lighting during the course of this tutorial. The way that I've structured these three elements in this course is fairly hierarchical, in that the first concern, composition, is mostly technical, because essentially what you're trying to do is to make the scene legible and to direct the viewer to the important elements within the scene or the image. Now, of course, you can be very creative in the ways that you do this, but it is still essentially a technical task. The other two elements, mood and style, are much more artistic. Now, most people understand that lighting helps to create a mood, but I think the style aspect of it is something that very few people actually consider. And what I mean by style is that your lighting can either be realistic or it can be highly stylized. Now, if you're puzzled by what I mean by stylized as opposed to realistic, don't worry, because I will be covering this in some depth later on. So let's start with composition. When you're lighting a scene, the first thing that you want to do is to ensure that the eye is always immediately drawn to the most important element within that scene. And that usually means a character, and specifically a character's face. And so while you can think of this as a technical task, it's also extremely important to understand that you can and often must take liberties. You mustn't be too literal in trying to recreate the physical world in your shot or your scene, because the primary concern of your lighting here is to tell your story. Recreating the actual real world is really only a secondary concern, and the only importance you must attach to it is that you don't want to create a scene that's so unbelievable that it takes your viewer out of the story. Cinematographers have a term which they call motivated lighting. And what motivated lighting is that in your scene, the light should appear to come from real-world light sources, from logical places, rather than from random directions. But even when you use motivated lighting, it's really important not to let that actually override the storytelling aspect of your lighting. And this scene is a great example of this. In this scene, the character appears to be lit by this table lamp on the side here. But of course, once you start examining this in detail, you can see that it just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Because if this table lamp was really lighting this character, it would also have a very bright hotspot directly underneath it, and another one up on the wall, and would probably be casting all sorts of distracting shadows all over the room. So in terms of lighting my scene, this table lamp's role is largely symbolic. It's not actually lighting my scene, it's merely a prop which is placed in that position to motivate my lighting. And the reason that I chose not to use the table lamp to literally light my scene is because that would have distracted from the storytelling aspects of the lighting. It would have created a very bright hotspot here, which would have taken the eye away from the important aspect of the image, which is the character's face, and it would have also created shadows, which would have damaged my composition. So although this setup does count as motivated lighting, you can see that there's still plenty of scope to take liberties in order to help you tell the story. And the way that you use light to tell your story is actually very simple. It can be summed up in one very simple sentence, which is shine your lights on the things that matter. And the main tool at your disposal for drawing the viewer's eye to the important areas of your scene is contrast. So that means that the areas that are not important in your shot should have low contrast, and the areas that are important in your shot should have much higher contrast. So in this case, the highest contrast in the entire image is the contrast between the boy's head and the pillow. And that naturally draws your eye to this area. and all of the lighting in the shot is geared to do exactly that. And this is why it's so important to be very vigilant not to inadvertently create areas of high contrast in your shot which aren't important to telling the story. Which is precisely why I didn't want to have a very bright hotspot underneath the lampshade, even if that cost me some realism, because I want the viewer to focus on the character. So this is something that you should be aware of every time you light a scene or a shot. Whether you want your lighting to be realistic, to appear to come from actual light sources, or whether your lighting is more stylized and abstract, you always want to be telling the story first and foremost. So in this scene we have a very similar setup. Lighting which at first glance appears to be motivated, appears to be coming from real light sources like the floor lamp and the fire, but which on closer inspection turns out to be quite artificial. The way that the character's eyes are so perfectly framed by a shaft of light simply couldn't be achieved by using the fire as a light source. I had to use a spotlight, of course, to achieve that effect. And no one viewing the image is ever going to do mental trigonometry to determine that I cheated with my lighting. However, there is a flip side to this which I also want to discuss, and it goes back to the point I made earlier about lighting the things that matter. When I was working as a lighting lead, I did encounter some lighting artists who would take this kind of technique to an absolute extreme. They would add 10, 15, sometimes 20 lights to their scenes. They'd be adding rim lights everywhere. They'd be lighting characters' hands. They would be using area lights to fill in any areas with dark shadows. And the scenes very quickly became unmanageable. But more importantly, all these extra lights were actually taking away from what was important, which was the focus of the shot. So personally, I like to try and keep the number of lights to the absolute minimum that's required to light the scene coherently and tell the story. If areas are in dark shadow and those areas aren't important and the shadows aren't distracting from the main focus of the scene, then I leave those areas in dark shadow. And I definitely do not like to add lights to things that aren't important in the actual composition. And this is especially important if you're working on an animated shot, because if your character is moving through the scene and the scene has an unmanageable number of lights, you're very quickly going to come across all sorts of inconsistencies. But also in terms of mental focus, if you concentrate on lighting the things that matter, that means that all your mental and artistic energy are going to be directed towards those rather than on unimportant or secondary aspects of the shot. And this will allow you to do your best work because you'll be focused on what's important rather than being caught up in irrelevant details. Moving on to this scene, which is using stylized lighting, because the theatrical lighting that's in use here means that I don't need to motivate my lighting. I don't need to pretend that I'm using household light fixtures as my light sources, which gives me much more freedom. But you can see that despite all of this, I have still stuck to the fundamental principle, which is to light the thing that's important. In this case, it's the character's face. The character's face is receiving much more light than the rest of the scene. Now, of course, my lighting is also creating mood and drama, especially with this huge shadow on the back of the stage, but the first thought is always to direct the eye to the character. And now we come to this image. And this image is particularly interesting to me because the lighting is much softer and the overall effect is much more subtle and less dramatic. But just because I'm not using the high contrast spotlights that I've been using in the previous images I've discussed, doesn't mean that I'm not using the same principles, because I am. My primary purpose in lighting, the first thing I do is to try and draw the eye to the character. Now you can do this with soft and subtle lighting just as well as if you were using hard, high contrast, dramatic lighting. So in this case, the way that the eye is drawn to the character is primarily with this bright highlight on his forehead and the contrast between the character's head and the wall behind him. Now in this scene, I am actually using pure motivated lighting. All of the light from the scene is coming from this big window here. There are no additional spotlights being used to pick out parts of the character. It is absolutely naturalistic lighting in this case. So in order to ensure that the character becomes the main focus of a scene like this, does require some careful scene management. So in this case, I made sure that his head was essentially the only thing that fell within the beam of this soft light coming from the window. All of the other elements of the scene are carefully placed outside of this main shaft of light. So even though the shaft of light is soft, it is still playing a vital compositional role. Now, one technique that's used over and over again in cinema is to use silhouettes to draw the viewer's eye. And the reason for this is that it basically follows the rule of using contrast to direct the viewer's eye. And in the case of silhouettes, you're using essentially the maximum contrast that's available. You've got something very, very dark in front of something very, very bright. But it's extremely effective, especially when you have a potentially very busy scene, such as this one from Skyfall. There's a lot going on in this room, but your eye is immediately drawn to the character here simply because of the contrast between him and the window behind him. Notice also how the shafts of light are directed deliberately towards the secondary character sitting in the chair. In this shot, the cinematographer is using contrast and lighting to take your eye on a journey. Your first stop is the main character being silhouetted by the window, and then the beams of light are then focusing your eye on the next stop, which is the character sat in the chair. And then finally, this bright light is attracting your eye to the third stop, which is also being used as a storytelling device, because you can see that the lamp has been knocked over, which indicates signs of a disturbance or a fight in the room. So you can see that clever use of lighting can convey an enormous amount of story information in a very short time. You take in this entire scene, and within a couple of seconds you immediately understand what's going on. Now you can imagine that this scene would have been far less effective if the lighting hadn't been so precisely designed to tell you exactly what was important. The lighting draws your eye to the important elements in the scene and omits everything else. Silhouettes are a device which are very commonly used in film and animation, and obviously they're particularly suited to stories that are dark and moody. So here's a few more examples. Here's one again from Skyfall, this time from Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and here's one from The Nightmare Before Christmas. So in this example, once again, we have a pretty busy scene, and the central character is actually very small in the frame, but your eye is immediately drawn to him because he's silhouetted by this huge moon behind him. And in this particular case, when you need to draw attention to something which is very small in the frame, you can see that the silhouette and contrast is a very effective method. In fact, Tim Burton is so keen on this particular technique that he used it again, and again, and again. Another device that's very commonly used in films and animation is a simple spotlight. Now this might seem really obvious, it's almost theatrical in its obviousness, but it's something that you will see a lot if you look for it. So this example is from Ratatouille, and you can see why the spotlight was used in this particular case, because the character is absolutely tiny in the frame in this vast sewer, so it's important for you to be able to find him quickly, which is why the lighting artists have simply placed him under a spotlight. It's a device actually that was used repeatedly in Ratatouille. I'll show you a few more examples. Here you can see, even though the character is much closer to the camera in this shot, they've put a spotlight around him so that you focus immediately on what's important, which is the character and the food all around him, and everything else simply just fades to darkness. And here is another shot, and I really like this one because this is a very busy scene, but thanks to the lighting, you find the important character straight away. So you can see that what they've done is they've put a spotlight around his table. Now there's other spotlights in the room as well, but this one is visibly brighter. You can see that the top of this table is lit much more brightly than any of the other tables, including the one that is closest to the camera. There's also table lamps dotted throughout the scene, but only the one on the main character's table actually is bright enough to light the underneath of his face. So with a busy scene like this, a good lighting artist is going to use contrast in order to focus the viewer's attention on what's important and always concentrate the maximum amount of contrast where it's needed and have much lower levels of contrast in other areas of the scene. And sometimes the technique is as simple and basic as simply shining your brightest lights on the things that matter the most. And finally, in this shot, we have an interesting variation on the spotlight technique. It's not an actual physical spotlight in this case, it's a spotlight made with the sky. So we have the brightest part of the sky, which is directly behind our main character, so that the eye immediately focuses on him. It's a variation on the silhouette. It's almost a combination of the spotlight and the silhouette techniques. And the secondary elements of the scene are simply there to give you a sense of location, but your eye is drawn to the area of high contrast, and the lighting is there to tell you that it's the character, not the environment, that's important in this shot. Something that you'll very often see in film and television is a more subtle use of the spotlight device, and that is to use a light to specifically pick out the face of the character or characters within the shot. So this particular example is from 6 Feet Under, and I've got a few other examples. This one is from Mad Men. You can see that we've got again a relatively busy scene, but Don Draper's face is being picked out very specifically with a spotlight kind of device. And of course the fact that he is being contrasted against the very dark background behind him helps to draw the eye even more strongly. Here's another example, and in this case we've got motivated lighting because there's a light fixture here, but you can see that the characters' faces are very clearly picked out against the background behind them. And another example from Mad Men, and once again you can see that the characters' faces have direct light shining on them, which invites us to look at the faces. The rest of the scene doesn't have direct lighting on it. It's only the characters that have this kind of lighting. It's very subtle, but subconsciously you pick up on it and you focus on the characters rather than on the incidental elements in the scene. And here is yet another example, this time taken from The Social Network. You can see it's exactly the same kind of device. The characters' faces are picked out with a spotlight so that you instantly focus on them. Now, another thing that's worth pointing out is when these spotlight type devices are used, they're almost always from the side, because you don't want to use frontal lighting because that's going to flatten the form and that's actually going to create less contrast. And what you're trying to do here is to enhance contrast to draw the eye to the point of interest. So by using a side light, you're creating light and shadow, there's form and there's increased contrast, and so the eye is naturally drawn to where you want it to go. And this is so important that it sometimes might mean, as in this particular example, that you might need to use 2 spotlights, one coming from each side, in order to highlight each face. And once you become aware of this technique and you start looking for it, you'll start seeing it absolutely everywhere. Here's a couple more examples. This one is taken from The Good Wife and this one from The West Wing. This spotlight effect can be taken to an absolute extreme, which is to just use a very narrow and focused shaft of light to pick out your character's eyes. Now, you may not have noticed it in the past, but once you start looking for it, it's an effect that you're going to see absolutely everywhere. And I've got a few examples that I've found on the web. This one is from James Bond. This is from the original Indiana Jones, another one from Indiana Jones. And this is from an old black and white film. In fact, this technique is so heavily used that it's almost a cliche, and it even has its own name. It's called the Shatner light, because apparently it was heavily overused in the original Star Trek series, as you can see in these shots. These concepts that I'm talking about are nothing new, so I've got a few examples from art history to demonstrate that they basically go back hundreds of years. In this painting by Jacques-Louis David, The Oath of the Hirashi, you can see that the painter has used the idea of maximum contrast to draw our eye to what's important in the scene, which is the 3 swords that are being held up by the father and the 3 brothers are making their oath to. Now, one thing that's interesting in this painting is actually the women on the right, which are inside the main shaft of light, but there's no contrast around them. All of the contrast is reserved for the area of interest, which is around the men. In this painting by Velázquez, Las Meninas, you can see that once again the painter is using light to draw our eye. The little girl is the only person who is standing directly in the light of the window. All of the other characters are just slightly outside of it. And once again, our eye is invited to go on a journey. We're immediately drawn to her, and then the eye wanders around to all the secondary characters, including this one, who is cleverly silhouetted in the shape of the doorway. In this painting by Vermeer, you can see the familiar trick of having the faces highlighted with a spotlight effect is being used to make sure that we focus on them and not on the rest of the scene. And in this painting by William Turner, it's a return of the device that we saw in the Ratatouille example, where an important foreground object is placed directly in front of the brightest part of the sky in order to draw our eye to it. So having looked at all of these various examples, let's return and discuss the fundamental points that lighting has to do in terms of composition. The first of these is to make the scene legible. You need to be able to understand what's going on in a complex and busy scene, and your lighting should always be in the service of making sure that the important elements are lit. To repeat the point that I made earlier, shine your brightest lights on your most important elements. Which takes us to point number 2, which is to direct the eye using brightness and contrast in order to make sure that the viewer looks at the important parts of the scene first. And both of these are serving the overall aim, which is to tell your story. So by making sure that your scene is legible, that your eye is focusing on what's important, you are able to make sure that the story is the only thing the viewer needs to think about. So having covered the compositional aspects of lighting, I'm now going to move on to the more abstract aspects, starting with mood. So obviously everyone's aware that you can create mood with your lighting, but what are the specific tools that you need to do this? When it comes to creating mood, you have 3 main weapons in your arsenal. These are key, color, and direction. So the key refers to whether your image is in a high key or a low key. A high key image is generally very bright, has low contrast, has very few dark shadows. A low key image is the opposite. It's much darker, the lighting is much more dramatic, much more contrasty, and there are far more dark shadows. Color obviously is self-explanatory. It depends what choice of colors you make in your lighting and how saturated those colors are going to be. And finally, direction refers to the direction that your main lights are coming from. And obviously different directions for lighting are going to have very different effects on the mood. For example, frontal lighting tends to be much less dramatic than side lighting or backlighting. One way that I like to think of lighting in terms of its impact on mood is to compare it with music, because I think just like music, lighting can have a really profound impact on the emotion in an image or an animation. It can be subtle, it can be dramatic, it can be happy, it can be sad. It has a lot in common with music in the way that it makes you respond emotionally to an image. So I like to think of it as being the visual equivalent of a soundtrack. So let's look at some concrete examples so I can talk about these 3 concepts that I've introduced, which are key, color, and light direction. So here we have what is obviously a low-key image. There's lots of very dark shadows in the image. Overall, it looks very dark and the lighting is very dramatic and high contrast. But what's interesting about this image is that despite the fact that it's got this dramatic low-key lighting, it's not menacing. It feels rather warm and inviting, and that's thanks to the other 2 elements, the light color and the light direction. The warm colors that I'm using in the lighting of the scene go a long way towards creating this inviting atmosphere, but also the fact that the character is lit frontally means that within this very dark, low-key environment, the character himself is actually lit in a high-key way. He's lit with very little contrast, there's no dark shadows on him. You could imagine that if the lighting was coming from the side, he'd look much more menacing and threatening, but with this frontal lighting, he doesn't. If I switch to Photoshop, I can quickly demonstrate the impact that color alone will have on this image. I've created a few variations where all I've changed is the color of the lighting. So you can see by simply changing the color of the lighting, I can profoundly impact the feeling that we get when we look at the scene. And this is why I like to compare lighting to music, because I think they're very similar in the way that they affect our emotions. And this is something you very much have to do by feel, because although we do have strong mental associations with various color schemes such as cool or warm, there's a lot of room here for subjectivity and judgment. And so this is one area where I feel there's a lot of room for you to use your creativity and your artistic judgment to create interesting moods and feelings. And here I have another variation which is subtly different to the original one. It still has the very dark background, but the lighting on the stage is slightly more complex. So it isn't quite as warm and inviting as the original. It just gives a subtly different kind of atmosphere. And here is a completely different approach to lighting the scene. This is very much a high key lighting setup with hardly any contrast, not a shadow to be seen anywhere. And you can see what a difference it makes to our emotional reaction to the image. Because there is far less drama in the lighting, our emotional reaction is also much more subdued. Now, there is a time and a place for subtlety. I don't think it works particularly well in this example, but there's certainly times when you want to take a softer, more subtle approach, and that's something I'll talk about again later on. And this brings us back to story, because it very much depends on the story and the message you're trying to get across at the time. If you're trying to say something that's subtle, that's ordinary, that's everyday, that's not dramatic, then there's definitely a case for using softer and non-dramatic lighting. But if the story point that you're trying to make is dramatic, then you'd want to use lighting a bit more like this. Now here we have low-key dramatic lighting with a strong sense of direction. There's lots of light and shade and contrast in the scene, and it gives a very different emotional reaction. And here are a couple more variations. Here we have strong backlighting and a silhouette, and you can see once again it gives you a completely different, much more intense reaction to the image. And here's another variation, mostly changing the color. So you can see that all I've changed in these 4 examples that I'm showing you is the lighting. Everything else is absolutely identical. And you can see with some changes to the lighting, there's an enormous range. There's a huge palette of emotion that you can tap into to express your ideas and to tell your story. Returning to the model maker image, I'd like you to think about what the lighting is doing here in terms of setting a mood and telling a story. The soft, low contrast, high key lighting is basically saying this is a scene that doesn't contain high drama. It's something more measured, something more subtle. The naturalistic lighting is familiar and inviting, and the subtle, soft lighting is a perfect match for this low key and subtle scene. So just like with music, you don't always need to have intensity and drama. Sometimes you can play it soft and mellow. It just depends on what you're trying to convey. And of course, the lighting in this image also works on another level because it knowingly references the work of Vermeer. The painting up here in the top right-hand side is a Vermeer, and the map, the globe, and the window are all obvious references to his work. A colleague of mine named Tim Crowson also did some alternative renders of this scene, which I'm going to show you now. First of all, there's a evening render, and then there's also a more contrasty daytime render. And you can see that because these examples are still quite naturalistic, it doesn't change the mood that much from the original, but there is still a visibly different feeling. I particularly like this one, and I think it's very effective. It's not quite as calm as my original. It has a little bit of extra intensity, but it doesn't ramp the intensity up too far, so it's still quite believable. And it just gives a slightly different feeling to the original. But I think what's interesting about these alternative renders is they show you that even when you're going for a specific mood and a naturalistic feel, there's always plenty of options at your disposal. There's always plenty of different ideas that you can explore. One thing that I like to do with my renders, particularly when I'm rendering a still, is to render out each light individually. That means in Modo, I'll create a bunch of passes, and in each pass I'll just have one light active, and I'll save each render out as a 16-bit float EXR, and I can recomposite the whole thing together in Photoshop, but with complete control over the color and intensity of each individual light in my scene. So what we're looking at here is the environment lighting on this particular scene, and I'm going to gradually reactivate all the other lights so that you can see how they all work together. So this is my main key light, and then I've got a rim light on top of that, and I've got luminous eyes on one character, and finally the distant house also has its own lights. And above each pass, I've got an exposure layer and a hue saturation layer. And that means that I can control the intensity and the color of each light independently of all the others. So for example, if I decided to reduce the intensity of the environment, I can do it here, increase the intensity of the environment, or I could go to the hue saturation layer and change the color of the environment. You can see it gives me an enormous amount of flexibility. And of course I can do the same with my key light, change the exposure, make it more intense, make it less intense, go to the hue saturation, change the color, let's go to the rim light, let's bring the exposure down. So you can see that basically this method allows you to completely relight your scene in post and gives you a lot of control over the final look. And you're not limited to Photoshop because of course you can have exactly the same kind of workflow in Nuke or Fusion. I've included this PSD as part of the assets for this tutorial. There's a link displayed right at the beginning of the video that shows you where you can download the assets. And you can have a play around with the file and come up with your own variations. And these are my two variations. This is my original scene, which was rendered in green and blue, but I've also got an alternative render with more saturated reds and a different shade of blue. And you can see that each file has basically got its own kind of feel. The green one is probably more disturbing and menacing, and the red-blue one is probably a little bit more friendly, although it's still quite strange looking. But what's really valuable about this method of adjusting your lighting in post is it allows you to do a lot of experimentation. So you can take your time and try different ideas and just see what works best for you and for your particular scene. And now I'm going to move on to my third element of lighting, which is style. So what do I mean by style? Well, let's have another look at two images which I discussed in the previous section, the Model Maker and the Baxter and Edmund image. The Model Maker is lit in a naturalistic and realistic way. There's only one light source in the image, and that's the window. It's a real world light source. You could imagine this scene being physically built and using nothing but natural light. The Baxter and Edmund image, on the other hand, is completely stylized. There's nothing naturalistic about the lighting at all. It is basically pure stage lighting. The lighting is purely for storytelling and aesthetic purposes, and there's no attempt made to try and pretend that these light sources are real world light sources. I've got a green key light coming from the left hand side, and I've got a white rim light coming from the top, and they're obviously artificial lights. And what this does is to give you another layer to your storytelling, because you can choose to tell your story in a naturalistic way, or you can tell it in a more stylized and more imaginative way. So the three elements of style are realism, motivation, and art direction. Realism is self-explanatory. Are you trying to create a realistic scene? Is your lighting attempting to be realistic? Motivation is basically to say, do you only ever use real light sources in your scene? Does all the light appear to come from genuine light sources, or do you sometimes cheat and use spotlights? And finally, art direction, which is the most interesting of all. How do you use colors to create a certain look? And ultimately, what kind of world are your characters inhabiting? Let's compare two different renders of the same character under very different lighting conditions. This first one is a fairly typical studio shot type of setup. So it's fairly naturalistic. It's the kind of lighting that we're accustomed to seeing on an everyday basis. So while the character looks quite threatening, the environment that he's in is familiar. Now let's compare it with this render, with much more heightened colors. This is far more stylized, and as a result, the character looks both more threatening and more cartoonish at the same time. So what the stylized lighting in this render is doing is telling us that we're not in our own familiar world, but we're in the world that this creature belongs to, a cartoonish world of heightened colors, which is very different from the more familiar world that this render relates to. And you can push stylization very far indeed. As you can see in this particular image, I wanted the character to inhabit a very alien and dreamlike world that's completely unfamiliar and very different to our own. And it's essentially the lighting that's really conveying this. Without the very saturated pink light, we wouldn't have this otherworldly, dreamlike feeling in this image. And this also shows you how creative you can be with your lighting, how lighting can be just as important to the overall look as, say, character design. It's one of the crucial tools that you have at your disposal to create a certain look, to create a certain atmosphere, to create a certain story in your images. And in another highly stylized example, you can see that once again I'm using very theatrical lighting. There's shadows going in different directions. There's absolutely no effort made to try and recreate naturalistic lighting. There's a spotlight which is very obviously highlighting the characters. It's all very carefully staged, and that suits this particular scene because we're not trying to create realism, we're trying to convey the sense of another world. And another device that I used in this particular scene was to use limited color, and this is all coming from the lighting because the actual props and characters are essentially all colorless, they're just white. I've got a blue light which is lighting my environment, which you can see in the background and in the shadows, and all my key and fill lights are using this warm light, and having the entire scene dominated by these two colors creates a very stylized look which happens to really suit this particular scene. And so this is another great example of how you can use art direction in your lighting to help you tell your story, and you have enormous scope for creativity and imagination. The approach that this image takes is slightly different to the two previous examples. Once again, we've got a very whimsical scene, but this time the lighting setup is much more naturalistic. There's a sun and a sky, so we're in familiar territory. However, the colors are heightened just slightly more than what you'd get in a genuinely real scene. So what that does is that it helps to reinforce the sense of whimsy while keeping everything grounded within a familiar environment. So the scene is still visibly stylized. No one would ever really think this was genuinely realistic lighting, but it's more familiar and less alien and extreme than the previous two examples. And this once again just goes to show there's a whole range of approaches you can take. You can do extremely stylized work where you push things really far, or you can be a little bit more nuanced and subtle in your approach. You're only really limited by your imagination. You might be tempted to think that the concepts I've been discussing only really apply to illustration and animation, and don't apply to something like film. Well, that really isn't the case, because style also very much applies to film. And in order to demonstrate this, I'm going to show you examples from the two extreme ends of the spectrum. So at one end of the spectrum, we have completely naturalistic lighting. Films using this style are shot using only natural light, sometimes known as available light. And I think the term available light tells you the philosophy behind this kind of style, which is you do the best that you can using only what is naturally available to you. So this was an approach that Clint Eastwood favoured in his westerns because I think he believed that using artificial light to light his films would make them less authentic. So this example is from Pale Rider. This is from High Plains Drifter. And here's another one from High Plains Drifter, and you can see that this style also extends to interior shots. So even if that means the shot is less legible or less aesthetically pleasing, he still stuck to this philosophy, which often meant that the interiors were very dark. And this adherence to this naturalistic style meant that he often had to make compromises visually. You can see that in this shot, the brightest part of the frame is actually what's going on outside the window, which has nothing to do with the characters on screen or the story. But I'm assuming that the reason that he used this naturalistic style is that he believed that using artificial lights to light the characters would take you out of their world and therefore out of the story. And here is another example, this time going back to Pale Rider, and you can see that once again it's lit using nothing but natural light, even if that means that the character's face falls in complete shadow, which of course you could argue simply adds to the mystique and in fact reinforces the story point that he's trying to make. But the truth is that this level of naturalism in lighting is actually very rare in cinema. Most directors and most cinematographers will try and make their lighting appear to be naturalistic, but will always use artificial lighting to help reinforce the composition and story points. So now that we've had a look at one extreme end of the spectrum, which is photography that only uses available light, let's have a look at the other end of the spectrum, which is to use extremely stylized lighting. And of course, the best film that could possibly illustrate this kind of lighting is Blade Runner. So in terms of lighting, Blade Runner is probably one of the most stylized films ever made. It makes absolutely no effort to create realism in its lighting. Everything is about looks and style. And there's actually an interesting progression in the film because, in my opinion, as the story progresses, the lighting actually gets more and more stylized until it reaches the climax in the final battle. So as you can see in this opening shot, there's some lip service paid to naturalism in that the light is coming in through the windows. But the first thing you'll notice is that even though we're indoors, everything seems to be shrouded in this extremely thick fog. And of course, the sole purpose for the fog is a visual one. It's there to simply catch the beams of light that are coming in through the window. And this thick atmosphere is used not only for the rest of this opening scene, but also throughout the rest of the movie. Practically every single set is shrouded in this thick fog with really obvious beams of light shining through it. Here we have it inside JF Sebastian's apartment. Here we have it inside Deckard's apartment. You can see the rays of light coming in over his head. And the way that these interiors are lit is the complete opposite to the examples I showed you earlier with the Clint Eastwood films, because there's nothing naturalistic about this lighting. It is completely stylized. Everything about it is about setting a mood and an aesthetic. And for most of the film, the lighting is very dramatic and low-key. The sets are very dark, shrouded in this thick atmosphere, and also using very, very cold lighting. All of the colors are predominantly blue and green, and this is all coming from the lighting itself. There's only one location in the film which uses a different color scheme and a different feeling, and that's the Tyrell Corporation. And in this location, although the lighting is still highly stylized, you can see it's taking a different approach. There isn't the thick volume. Here we have a clear atmosphere and obviously a completely different color scheme with much warmer colors. The one thing it does retain though is the very dark shadows to give it a low-key kind of feel. And as the story progresses, the stylization of the lighting becomes ever more extreme. As Deckard finds JF Sebastian's apartment and encounters the replicants, you can see that the lighting gets more and more intense. The stylization becomes more and more obvious. And this increasing intensity really helps to drive the story. The visual intensity matches the emotional intensity of the final battle. And of course, this completely unrealistic lighting actually helps to drive the story along, because this highly stylized world is so different from our own that we're projected into the dystopian future that the story is set in. And the truth is that a general audience simply doesn't care about realism when it comes to lighting. All they really care about is the impact of the visuals, and no one can deny that this film obviously had a huge impact visually, and people remember it decades later because it looks so cool. Although you could argue that its influence is starting to work against it because it is beginning to look a little bit dated. I know that when I saw Blade Runner when I was 14 years old, I was blown away by it, whereas now when I watch it again 30 years later, it does look a little bit too much like a music video for my tastes. But I think at the time it was genuinely revolutionary in terms of cinematography and lighting. In terms of style, I think this kind of approach is the one that we're most used to seeing. It appears to be naturalistic, but of course the lighting is subtly geared towards telling the story, towards lighting the character's face. And actually this kind of hybrid lighting has an enormous amount of craft involved with it. You can see that the character's face is lit in a very interesting way with this beam of light falling across it. There's pools of light and shadow in the background, so the scene doesn't look flat and boring. It looks alive and interesting. And then moving to the example from Mad Men, I'd say that the level of stylization here has been ramped up a little bit. we're not in the realms of pure naturalism anymore. There's definitely a sense of a look being created, of some art direction going on. And returning to our example from the social network, we can see that once again this is a hybrid approach to stylization. It's trying to appear to be naturalistic. There's nothing overtly stylized about this shot, but we know that at the same time they're not constraining themselves by realism, and they're allowing themselves to add additional lights in order to make the characters' faces more legible in the scene. So just like with any art form, there's a whole spectrum of expression and possibilities, and it's essentially up to you to make your own judgments about the level of stylization you'd like to have in your images. I thought it'd be interesting and fun to take this fairly standard ArchViz scene, which obviously uses very naturalistic lighting, and change it into something completely different. In this case, I'm going to make a Blade Runner type film set from this scene, changing nothing but the lighting. And I hope this can help to reinforce the concepts of setting a mood and using stylization, because we're going to completely transform the image and it's going to end up giving a completely different feeling. So at the moment what we have is a high key scene set with neutral lighting using naturalistic lighting techniques. And we're going to end up with something that's basically the opposite. It's going to be very low key, very dramatic, and using highly stylized lighting. So the first thing I'm going to do is to disable all the area lights that are in the windows, because I'm going to use the environment instead of area lights to drive the ambient lighting. And next I'm going to select the environment and I'm going to make the environment material very, very dark. So let's drive it all the way to black and then just drive the values up just a fraction. Having done that, I'm going to unpause preview and see what I've got. So already we've got something much darker and moodier. I want to color this light fixture which is in the middle of the room. So what I've done is I've got a blue constant which I've added just above the light material, and I'm going to enable that. And that's going to give us, again, more stylized blue lighting in the room. So with that done, the next step is to add a volume light so that we've got a shaft of light coming into the room, Blade Runner style. So what I've done is I've added a spotlight which is pointing in through this window here. And I've angled this light so that it's pointing into the room at this kind of oblique angle. So with the light enabled, I'm going to unpause preview. I'm going to select the light in the item list. And as you can see at the moment, it's not doing very much because we need to enable the volumetrics. So I'm going to enable volumetrics, have a look at the initial result. And again, at the moment, it's not doing quite enough because the volumetrics aren't coming into the room. So I'm going to double their length to 20 meters. And hopefully now we'll get something a little more dramatic and effective. And this is certainly looking much better, but this warm color I've got on the volumetric light, which looks pretty nice in its own right, doesn't really match the reference I've got from Blade Runner, where all the volumetrics are very, very cool in color. So I'm going to select the material for my spotlight, and I'm going to change this warm color to something much cooler, something more like a bluey green. And you can see that immediately this gives it a more science fiction feel. I'm just going to tweak it so it's slightly more green than blue, just so that it matches my reference from Blade Runner a little bit more closely. So now I've gone a long way towards creating the feeling that I was looking for. I've got this very dark, low-key scene with this very atmospheric volume light that has an unnatural color to create this science fiction looking set. But what I now need to do is to make sure that I direct the viewer's eye to the point of interest. So obviously in this case, this would be the chair. So what I need to do is to add some more light and contrast to the chair so the eye is immediately drawn to it. So in order to do this, I've got a new area light which I've added to the scene. I'll just enable it now in the item list. And you can see I've positioned it relative to the camera, so it's pointing to the chair and it just catches the reflections on the sides of the chair. So we'll have a nice bit of really bright contrast on this front part of the chair. But I want this area light to only affect the chair. I don't want it to affect anything else in the scene. So in order to do that, I'm going to need to use light linking. So I'm going to set up a light linking group. So I'm just going to press spacebar to deselect everything in my scene. And I'm just going to select the chair in the viewport. Then I'm going to go to my groups. I'm going to go new group from selected items, and I'm going to call it chair light linking. And then I'm going to return to my item list, select my area light, just go to the light linking section, toggle control light linking, select my item group that I've just created, and set the mode to include. And with that done, I'm going to unpause preview and have a look at the results. So with this bright reflection on the front of the armchair, we now have a focal point for our scene. And you can see by changing the lighting, we have completely transformed the look of the scene. We've come an awfully long way from the original, which I've got open in a separate session of Modo. There's really no comparison between the original soft, naturalistic scene and the low-key, dramatic scene that I've now created. And so I hope this really illustrates how much control and power you've got with lighting alone. Without making any changes to textures, to layout, you can create a completely different atmosphere simply by changing your lighting. As a second practical example, I'd like to take a look at the model maker scene. And once again, we're going to change the lighting to completely change the feeling in the scene. And stylistically, I am also going to go for a slightly different approach. I'm not going to go for the heavily stylized look that I used in the Blade Runner type example. This time I'm going to go for a hybrid approach, which is going to be mostly naturalistic, but with a little bit of cheating, just in order to emphasize the character and to make sure that the composition and story is coming across the way I want it to. So what I want to do here is change the time of day from daytime to nighttime. And obviously this is going to create a completely different mood. So the first thing I'm going to do is to select the area light that's just behind the window, locate it in the item list by hovering my cursor over the item list and pressing the F key, and then I'm going to disable this area light. Next, I'm going to scroll down to the environment and change the environment color from the bright white that I've got here to a dark blue. So I'll just drag everything down to black and then just bring back a little bit of the blue. Something a little bit like this. Having done that, I'm going to unpause preview and just check on the results. So now that I've taken care of the environmental lighting, I need to add a light source to light the interior of the room. So I'm going to imagine that he's working by candlelight, and I'll start by placing a point light, and once I've decided on the final placement of the point light, I will actually add a modeled candle to the scene so that we've got a motivated light source for our interior. So I'm going to add a point light to the scene. So let's go to create light, point light. And what I'll do is I'm just going to drag it up the item list so it's in a slightly better spot, not right at the bottom. And because this scene is built like a miniature, the scale is very small and you can see my light's enormous in the scene. So I'm going to go to the display. And I'm going to reduce the size to 0.01 so that it's more of a candle-sized light source. And the next thing I want to do is to bring it up so it's at least above the tabletop. So I'm going to activate the move tool and just bring the light up above the tabletop. And just to make preview more responsive, I'm going to disable GI. And let's unpause preview and just see what the point light looks like. So obviously it's way too bright, so I'm going to reduce the intensity. And I'm also going to change the color of the light from pure white to a warmer orange because candles give off very warm light. So let's reduce the green component and let's reduce the blue a lot. And that's a much nicer looking light. So next I need to think about the placement of the light. My main priority in the placing of this light is obviously going to be composition. I want to direct the eye to the character. I also think it will be more dramatic if he's backlit rather than frontlit or sidelit. So I'm going to select the point light and activate the move tool. And with GI turned off, we should find that preview is quite responsive. So I'm just going to zoom in slightly in the viewport and start moving my light around, and we can see what effect it has when I put it in different placements in the room. And you can see what I was saying, frontal lighting doesn't look that great. So if I was to put the candle here, it doesn't make for a very interesting image. Whereas when I put it on the other side of the character, we get much more interesting results. So what I like about this kind of placement is that it draws the eye immediately to the character's face, because the highest point of contrast in the room is right where the character's face is, with a very bright light behind him and his head almost silhouetted against the very bright light. So what I'm going to do now is just take a little bit of time just to refine my placement, just to find the perfect spot. And just so you don't have to watch me making these sort of micro tweaks, I'm just going to pause the video until I'm perfectly happy with the placement of the light. So I've fine-tuned the placement of my point light so that I'm now happy with its position. I think it's a little bit too bright though, so I'm going to reduce the intensity to 0.1. And I'm also going to give it a tiny bit of a radius, because a real candle flame would have a tiny radius, and that will help to make the shadows just slightly softer and the overall lighting a little bit more realistic. So with that done, I'm just going to re-enable GI in preview and just have a look at what my lighting currently looks like. So as preview clears up, I can see I'm not really that happy with the overall balance of the lighting, because I think the environment is far too bright compared to the candle. Now there's a couple of things I could do to fix this. I could go to the environment and reduce its intensity, but I think part of the problem is the way that I'd set the exposure up in the original daylight version of this scene. I'd reduce the white level in order to increase the exposure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset the white level back to its default value of 1. You can see immediately that makes the scene much darker, and having done that, I can go back to the point light and increase its intensity once again. And I think that now, once preview clears up, we should have a much more pleasing balance between the candle and the environment. So now that I'm much happier with the balance between the environmental lighting and the interior lighting, it's time to look at the scene critically. So in terms of leading the eye straight to the model maker, I'm really happy with the placement of the point light. However, one thing I'm not so happy with is the fact that it is quite difficult to see the features on his face. So like many of the examples that I showed earlier, I think it'd be a good idea to add a spotlight to the scene to just help to pick out his facial features. So I'm going to add a spotlight to the scene. I'm going to do this from the item menu, create light spotlight. And as you can see, it comes in rather large, so I'm going to locate it in the item list, go to the display properties, and just make it a lot smaller in the viewport. Since I know that I want the spotlight to always point at the character's face, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a locator to the scene, which I'm going to place right in front of his face, and I'm going to constrain the spotlight to it so that it always points to it. So I'll add my locator from the item menu and make it a little bit smaller in the viewport. And what I'm going to do is activate the move tool and just place it right in front of his face. Let's just use the numerical keypad. I just hit 3 on the numerical keypad just so I can place the locator right in front of his nose. And then I'll just go back to my perspective view from here. And then if I scroll down to the bottom of the item list, I can locate my spotlight, hold down Shift and select the locator. And in the spotlight properties, if I go to set target, you can see that it's now constrained the spotlight so that it always points at the locator. So once again, I'm going to go to the preview options and disable GI just so that preview is more responsive while I place this spotlight. And I'm just going to make sure I only select the spotlight, activate the move tool, and we should see I can move the spotlight around the scene. It's always constrained to the locator and is always pointing at the character's face. So what I want is to just pick out his profile using the light. So once again, I'm just going to pause the video while I place my light. I've positioned my light so it's just picking out the character's profile and giving a little bit of definition to his face. However, you can see there's a mismatch between the color of the spotlight and the original candle. The spotlight is still colored white. So what I'm going to go and do is locate the spotlight material in the shader tree, and I'm going to give it an orangish color, which is going to match the candle. And now you can see it's a much better match and looks as if it belongs in the scene. Now, just to emphasize this effect a little bit more strongly, I'm going to increase the intensity of this spotlight. So let's turn it up to 7. And now you can see it really is helping to define his features. So once again, I'm going to re-enable GI and have a look at the final result. So now that I've done a preview render with GI, you can see that adding the point light and the additional spotlight to the scene is also giving us a very beneficial side effect, which is they're adding more bounce light in the scene. I've got my GI bouncer set to 8 here, so the two lights are bouncing around the room and helping to provide some fill light on the character's face and making the silhouetting look a little bit less stark. Now before I do a final render of this scene, I'm going to add a model of a candle so it looks as if the point light is coming from a genuine light source. So I'll just pause the video while I import my candle model into the scene. And here is the model of a candle, and you can see I've placed it and scaled it so it appears as if the point light is coming out of the flame, and you can just see it in the render behind his hands, and it's just there basically to make sure that the point light doesn't appear to be floating in midair. So at this stage, all that's left for me to do here is to do a final render, and I usually use preview to render my stills, so I'm going to hit F8 to bring up preview render, and I'm going to make sure that it's set to full resolution with everything set to maximum quality settings. Draft displacements isn't on, draft fur isn't on, etc. And I'm just going to start the render and let it cook. And after rendering for a few hours, this is what we've got, and I think it looks really good. In a minute we'll compare it with the original, but I think you can see it gives a very different mood. So here we have the original version of the Model Maker scene, and you can see that the overall mood here is really calm. If I compare it to our latest render, you can see the feeling is completely different. We've lost the sense of calmness and it feels much more intense now. And the only thing that's changed is the lighting. And the thing that I find really interesting in comparing these two renders is how even the facial expression appears to be rather different. If I go back to the original one, you can see he seems very contented. He seems to be smiling. He's engrossed in his work, but not in a sinister kind of way. And yet, when we look at the new version, he doesn't appear to be smiling anymore. And his look of calm relaxation has now changed into something much more intense. So it's really interesting how lighting can psychologically affect us into thinking that this character has got different thoughts going on in his head. And I think it also really shows the power that lighting has over storytelling. So in conclusion, I'm going to do a short section on compositing and post-work. Because essentially compositing is just an extension of lighting. It's the finishing stages, but all of the principles that apply to lighting also apply to compositing. So when you're compositing, your first priority is always going to be the story. And this means that all of the principles that we would apply to lighting also apply to compositing, which means that our first priority should be composition, and next should be mood, and finally style. So once again, what I've done here is to render each one of my lights in this scene separately so that I can control them all in post. So at the bottom of the stack, I have just the environmental lighting, and then I have the candle light, and finally the spotlight. And having them rendered as separate layers means that I can control the intensity and also the color of each light separately. So all of my lights have been saved separately as 16-bit float EXRs, and when you open 16-bit float EXRs in Photoshop, it will convert them to a 32-bit float file. The rule of thumb here is that if you're saving out a color-based output, such as a lighting output or a shading output or a final color output, then 16-bit EXR is the ideal file format because EXR saves as a floating point format, so it holds a large amount of dynamic range, and you need to be aware that there's a big difference between a 16-bit float file such as an EXR and a 16-bit integer file such as a PNG or a TIFF, because 16-bit integer will be clamped. It won't have a large amount of dynamic range, whereas a 16-bit EXR will do. Essentially, the EXR format was specifically designed with compositing in mind, so for any color-based outputs, 16 bits is absolutely fine. The only time you ever really need to save out as a 32-bit EXR is if you're rendering out a data-based output where a high amount of precision is required. For example, if you're rendering out things like world coordinates or motion vectors, but for any color-based output, 16-bit is more than adequate. If you're interested in a more in-depth discussion of high dynamic range compositing, I recommend that you watch my ultimate guide to tone mapping because I cover all of these things in a lot more detail there. So returning to the Photoshop document that I've got open here, you'll see that I've added an exposure adjustment layer and a hue saturation adjustment layer above each one of these lighting passes, and these adjustment layers are clipped to the relevant layers below them. And you'll notice that I've applied a gamma correction on my exposure adjustment layers. The only reason I need to do this is because this scene was originally created in an older version of Modo, which was Modo 601, before all of the modern color workflow was added to the application. So for scenes created in newer versions of Modo, you wouldn't need to do this. So with everything now set up in Photoshop, I can go and adjust the intensity of each one of these layers. So for example, if I wanted to increase the intensity of the light coming from outside, you can see I've got a lot of leeway to do this. And then I could go and reduce the saturation to give it more of a daylight feel, for example. I can also control the tone mapping, which I'll show you in a minute. But in the meantime, let me just reset my hue saturation and let's just dial this back down a little bit. I'm going to bring it up a touch. Let's go to my candle. I can do the same thing, just increase the intensity here. And once again, you can see it's blowing out, but I'm going to control the tone mapping in a separate pass in a minute. Finally, let's go to my spotlight. Let's see if we can increase that just a touch, something like that. I'd like to retain the non-destructive aspect of this workflow in case I decide to come back and change any of these values later on. So in order to do this, I'm going to need to decouple this compositing stage from the tone mapping. And the way to do this is to convert all of this to a smart object. So I'm going to select all of my layers and just go convert to smart object. And once the smart object's been created, I'm just going to rename it to master composite. And then to do the tone mapping, what I need to do is to duplicate this smart object on top of itself. And then on top of the duplicate, I'm going to add a solid color set to white. I'm going to clip that to the layer below it. I'm going to set the solid colors blending mode to add. And then I'm going to select the copy of the master composite smart object and set its blending mode to divide. And you can see as soon as I do that, we have a tone mapped image. Now the tone mapping is a little bit too strong for my taste right now, but that's not a problem because I can simply adjust the opacity of the layer. And this acts just like the burn control would do in a render engine. So you can see as I reduce the opacity, we get more burn, and as I increase the opacity, we get less burn. So it's just a case of finding the right level. I want a little bit of burn, but I just don't want it to be completely blown out like that. So we'll go sort of around halfway. And the great thing about this smart object workflow is that if I decide that I want to go back and change anything, all I need to do is just to reopen the smart object and edit it. So let's say, for example, I want to increase the intensity of the spotlight, which is highlighting the features on the character's face. I'll double click on the smart object. That will reopen my original document. I just need to locate the spotlight, go to its exposure adjustment, and simply adjust it from there. Once I'm happy, I save the file, and then I can return to the master document. So once the smart object has been saved, I can simply close it, return to the master document, and everything is updated accordingly. Now at this stage, I'd actually like to start using more of Photoshop's functionality, but as I'm still in 32 bits per channel, a lot of my options are grayed out. So what I can actually do is to non-destructively convert my document to either 16-bit integer or to 8-bit even, while still preserving all of my original 32-bit data by using nested smart objects. So I'll show you how to do this. So what I'm going to do is just to select everything in my layer list and create a new smart object. So once that's done, I'm just going to rename my new smart object to tone mapping. And having done that, I can non-destructively reduce the bit depth of the image. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to go all the way down to 8-bit. Make sure to click the don't merge option and just wait for the conversion to take place. And now you can see that I'm in 8 bits per channel. I've got all of the Photoshop tools available to me. So if I wanted to add a color balance layer, for example, I could. make some adjustments, etc. But if at any point I want to go back to my tone mapping or to my original compositing, all I need to do is to double click on this smart object layer, and you can see when that opens, that is still in 32 bits per channel. And the same applies to the original composite. When I open that, that is still in 32 bits per channel. So you can see that this is a completely non-destructive workflow. So what I'm going to do now is, as well as my color balance layer, I'm going to add a curves adjustment layer and also a hue saturation adjustment layer on top of that. And I'll pause the video while I make a few tweaks, because rather than make you watch every single tweak I do, I think it'd be better just to do the tweaks and then talk about them once they're done. So I've done a little bit of grading to the image. Essentially, I've just tweaked the contrast and tried to unify the color scheme a little bit. If I just disable my new adjustment layers, you can see that I've made everything a little bit warmer and tried to unify the color scheme around the warm red and to play down the cooler blue and also the yellow. And the reason that I've done this is just to make the image more cohesive compared to the original. More cohesive, easier to read, and it goes back to our story points of composition and mood. And the curves adjustments I've made are relatively subtle. What I wanted to do was just to slightly decrease the contrast, mainly to add a little bit of a lift to his face. You can see it's very subtle, but I just thought it made the character more readable. And finally, to the hue saturation adjustment, what I've done here is just to reduce the saturation. You can see what happens when I disable it. Because of the color balance and the curves adding on top of each other, the image became very saturated and looked unnatural, I thought. So I've reduced the saturation a little bit just to make it more naturalistic feeling. And this relates back to the idea of stylization, because the amount of saturation that you have really depends on how naturalistic you want your results to be. You can have very saturated images, which of course would be stylized, or very under-saturated images, and these would also be stylized. So it really is a question of judgment whether you want to be in the naturalistic or the stylized range. And in fact, I would say that at the moment this image is slightly oversaturated still, so I'm tempted to just reduce the saturation just a few more points to bring it back to something a little bit more naturalistic, because I think a naturalistic look really suits this particular image. So you can see that when you're grading, you're essentially just fine-tuning, but with exactly the same objectives as when you're lighting, and so you should approach it with the same mindset and the same emphasis on composition, mood and style and storytelling. If you prefer a nodal compositing workflow, then Fusion or Nuke are probably much better options than Photoshop. And the great thing about working in a nodal compositor is that you don't have this sort of kerfuffle with having to create smart objects. Nodal compositors are built from the ground up for dealing with HDR files, so they tend to handle them much better. You don't have the limitations that you would have in Photoshop, for example, where only a subsection of the tools are available to you when you're working in a high dynamic range format. So here I've got Fusion open, and the reason I've chosen Fusion over Nuke is that Fusion is freely available. You can download it for free from the Blackmagic website, whereas Nuke is rather expensive, but the workflow is actually very, very similar in both applications. So I've brought in my 3 lighting passes into Fusion. We're looking at the environmental lighting pass now, and this one is the candlelight, and this one is the spotlight. So what I need to do is to comp them together. So I'm going to select the environmental light, open the bins, and just double click on the merge node to add it to the flow. So I'll focus my viewer onto my merge node, and then I'll connect the next pass to it. And you'll see that in Fusion there isn't actually an additive blending mode. So what you need to do is to use the normal blending mode, but then turn the alpha gain down to 0. And you can see as I do this, we get additive blending. So to merge the spotlight into my comp, what I need to do is to make sure I've still got this merge node selected, open the bins again, double click on another merge node, and once again focus my viewer on it by hitting 1 on the numeric keypad and connecting my third pass to it. And once again, because it's not blending it additively, I need to reduce the alpha gain so that it's added to the previous merge node. And with my layers comped together, the next thing to do is to add some actual compositing nodes. So I'm going to right click in my flow and I'm going to go to add tool, and I'm going to go to macros, and I'm going to add the filmic macro. Now I've included the filmic macro for Nuke and for Fusion with the assets for this tutorial, so you can follow along yourselves if you want to. And once again, if you want a much more in-depth discussion of this filmic tone mapping, I'd point you to my ultimate guide to tone mapping, where it's covered in some detail. So next I'll connect my merge node to my filmic tone mapper, and then I'm also going to add a color corrector to my flow. And then finally on top of that I'm going to add a soft glow, which is in the blur filters, and I'm going to connect that to my output node, which is going to write a PNG file. And the final step is to just hit 1 on my output node so that it connects the whole chain up and I see the final result. You can see my soft glow is a little bit too crazy, so I'm just going to hit Control P just to disable it temporarily. So there's not enough contrast in the comp right now, and that's because of my filmic tone mapper. You'll see if I disable it, I get a lot of burn back in the image. So what I want is some tone mapping, but I don't want it to be quite as strong as that. So I'm just going to quickly adjust all these curves to get something more or less workable. I'll come back and fine tune it all later, but you can see that by adjusting these sliders, you've got a very fine amount of control over the tone mapping in your comp. And the same applies to the color correction node, because color correction in a nodal compositor is much more powerful than in Photoshop, in my opinion. You've got much finer control over the levels of colors and saturations in the shadows, midtones, and highlights. So once again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video while I make my color and tone mapping adjustments, and we'll come back and I'll explain my choices and why I made them. So I've spent a little bit of time doing some grading on this render, and if we compare the before and after, this is the ungraded output of my composited nodes, and this is the final result after my grading. So you can see that my grading is pretty subtle. What I've actually done is just to take out the burn from the lights, just to tone map them a little bit to bring the contrast back within a less extreme range. And then I've just done a bit of minor color correction. So once again, if we just have a look at the tone mapping prior to the color correction, you can see that what I've done with the color correction is similar to what I did in Photoshop, is just basically unify everything towards the warmer reds. And I've been careful not to be too heavy-handed with my color grading, because I want to keep it within the naturalistic range. I don't want the colors to be too saturated and too stylized. And then finally after that, I've added a tiny little bit of glow to the render, so that'll be much easier to see if I zoom in to 100%. You just temporarily disable the glow and then re-enable it. And you can see it's very, very subtle. And again, this goes back to the idea of naturalism versus stylization. If you want to do something that really is photorealistic, which basically is to reproduce the effects of a physical camera, then you're going to need to add a little bit of glow or bloom or glare to your renders, because physical lenses are always going to have a little bit of blooming in the brightest highlights. But of course, just as with saturation, there's a balance between naturalism and stylization, so a subtle amount of glow is going to create something naturalistic, and a heavier, stronger amount is going to create something more stylized. So as always, it's up to you to exercise your judgment and decide on what level of naturalism or stylization you might want. For example, I could increase the amount of glow in this render and achieve a much more sort of dreamlike result, but I think it doesn't really suit the story that I'm trying to tell here. I prefer a more naturalistic result, which is why I've gone for something a little bit more subtle. So I hope this very short demonstration of Fusion has shown you that using a nodal compositor will allow you to do your grading much more quickly than if you're using Photoshop, simply because if you're trying to use HDR files in Photoshop, you have to jump through hoops to work around the limitations of not having the whole Photoshop toolset available to you when you're working in 32-bit. And generally, a nodal compositor such as Nuke or Fusion is also going to give you much finer control over your colors, your contrast, and your grading. So this concludes this guide to lighting for storytelling. I hope you found the tutorial interesting and informative, and I strongly encourage you to play around with all the assets that I've included, the 3D scenes, and also all of the compositing scenes, and to see if you can create your own versions of these scenes with their own moods and their own looks. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you again next time.